America is a nation built on water. From the Chesapeake to the Great Lakes, from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific Northwest, boats have defined how we work, how we play, and how we connect to the landscapes that shaped this country. For generations, owning a boat meant freedom. It meant summer weekends, family traditions, and the promise that hard work could buy you a little piece of the American dream. But something is going wrong. Across the United States, boat dealerships are reporting their worst quarter in over a decade. Inventory is piling up, sales are collapsing, and the confidence that once fueled this industry is evaporating faster than morning fog on a quiet harbor. From January through April of 2025, only 64,883 new boats were sold, down from 71,321 during the same period in 2024. That's a 9% drop. But the real shock came in April, when retail new boat sales plummeted 40% in a single month. Dealers who survived the pandemic boom, who expanded their lots and hired more staff, are now staring at rows of unsold boats and wondering if they'll make it through the year. Here's what most people missed, and why this collapse matters far beyond the marina. To understand what's happening now, you have to understand what boats have always meant to this country. Boating isn't just recreation, it's an industry that employs hundreds of thousands of Americans. From fiberglass workers in Florida to marine electronics installers in Seattle. From marina operators in the Carolinas to dealership sales teams in Minnesota. It's an economy built on craftsmanship, on local knowledge, on the belief that water is meant to be explored. For generations, boat building was a family business. Fathers taught sons how to lay fiberglass, how to wire electrical systems, how to balance a hull for speed and stability. These weren't just jobs, they were identities, passed down like heirlooms, rooted in communities where the nearest body of water was more than scenery. It was livelihood. The American boat market boomed for decades. Through the 1980s and 90s, manufacturers expanded. Companies like Boston Whaler, Sea Ray, and Grady White became household names. Pontoon boats transformed lazy afternoons on lakes into social gatherings. Wake boats turned water skiing into a high-tech sport. Fishing boats became floating command centers, equipped with sonar, GPS, and live wells that kept catches fresh. By the early 2000s, owning a boat was no longer reserved for the wealthy. Middle-class families could finance a 20-foot bow rider or a pontoon and spend summers on the lake. Marinas expanded. Dealerships opened in landlocked states, serving customers who'd trailer their boats to reservoirs and rivers. The industry supported an entire ecosystem: trailer manufacturers, insurance companies, fuel dock operators, marine repair shops, boat lift installers, winterization services. Every boat sold meant jobs, taxes, and economic activity rippling through coastal and lakeside communities. Then came 2008. The financial crisis hit the boat industry harder than almost any other sector. Boats are discretionary purchases, luxuries that disappear when budgets tighten and credit dries up. Dealerships closed. Manufacturers laid off workers. Brands that had been around for decades filed for bankruptcy or were absorbed by larger companies. The recovery was slow. By the mid-2010s, sales had stabilized, but never returned to pre-crisis levels. Dealers became cautious. Manufacturers kept inventory lean. Financing tightened. The industry learned to survive on smaller margins and lower expectations. It was a new normal, steady but subdued, profitable but no longer explosive. And then, in 2020, everything changed again. The COVID-19 pandemic should have destroyed the boat industry. Instead, it saved it. As lockdowns spread and Americans were told to stay home, those who could afford it looked for ways to escape safely. Boats became the perfect pandemic purchase. They offered outdoor recreation, social distancing, and a way to avoid crowded beaches and pools. Families who'd never considered owning a boat suddenly wanted one. First-time buyers flooded dealerships. People who'd been thinking about upgrading pulled the trigger. The industry saw demand unlike anything in its history. In 2020 and 2021, manufacturers sold over 300,000 new boats, record numbers that shattered previous highs. Dealerships couldn't keep inventory on their lots. Boats sold before they arrived. Customers put deposits down on models they hadn't even seen. Lead times stretched from weeks to months. Used boat prices skyrocketed as buyers, desperate for anything, turned to the secondary market. Manufacturers responded the way any business would. They ramped up production. Factories that had been running conservative shifts added workers and expanded capacity. Supply chains, already strained by the pandemic, struggled to keep up with demand for engines, electronics, upholstery, and fiberglass. But the orders kept coming. Dealerships expanded their lots, opened new locations, and hired more sales staff. Lenders, seeing strong demand and rising asset values, loosened credit standards. Buyers with marginal credit could finance boats they couldn't have qualified for just months earlier. Interest rates were at historic lows. A 30-foot boat that would have required a 20% down payment could now be financed with almost nothing down. The industry was printing money, and everyone believed it would last. But economies don't boom forever. By late 2021, the first cracks appeared. Lead times that had been 6 months stretched to a year. Customers who'd placed deposits grew frustrated, waiting for boats that kept getting delayed. Some canceled orders. Others who'd bought boats during the frenzy realized that owning a boat was more expensive and complicated than they'd imagined. Fuel costs, maintenance, insurance, marina fees, winterization, the bills added up. First-time buyers who'd purchased on impulse discovered that boats require constant attention. Fiberglass needs waxing. Engines need servicing. Electrical systems fail. Trailers rust. And unlike cars, boats can't just sit unused. They deteriorate faster when neglected than when used. Some pandemic buyers sold their boats after a single season, flooding the used market with barely broken-in vessels. Then, in 2022, the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates to combat inflation. The impact on the boat market was immediate and severe. Buyers who could have financed a $50,000 boat at 3% interest suddenly faced rates of 7, 8, or even 10%. Monthly payments doubled. Marginal buyers disappeared overnight. Dealerships that had been selling boats as fast as they arrived suddenly had inventory sitting on their lots. Manufacturers, who'd ramped up production to meet 2021 demand, were now producing boats for a market that no longer existed. Wholesale shipments began piling up at dealerships that didn't want more inventory, but the contracts had been signed. The boats kept coming. A 40-foot cruiser that would have required monthly payments of $650 at 3% interest now demanded $1,200 at 8%, a difference that pushed the purchase beyond what most families could justify. The math was brutal and simple. Higher rates meant fewer qualified buyers, longer loan terms to keep payments manageable, and dramatically increased total interest paid over the life of the loan. Dealers watched as customers who'd been pre-approved for financing in late 2021 returned in 2022, only to be rejected by the same lenders, using the same credit criteria but different rate environments. The lending landscape transformed almost overnight from accommodating to restrictive, with banks and marine finance companies tightening underwriting standards to protect themselves against rising default risks they could see coming. Trade-ins that had been valuable during the boom suddenly became liabilities, with dealers offering thousands less than buyers expected, because used boat values were already beginning their decline. Customers who'd been eager to upgrade discovered they were trapped in their current boats, unable to get enough from trade-ins to make new purchases feasible without bringing substantial cash to the transaction. The showroom traffic that had been constant during the pandemic boom slowed to a trickle as potential buyers stayed home rather than face the disappointment of learning they could no longer afford what they could have purchased just months earlier. Sales appointments that once resulted in deposits and signed contracts increasingly ended with customers walking away, promising to think about it but never returning. Dealers began offering incentives they hadn't needed during the boom. Discounted dock fees, free winterization, extended warranties, anything to overcome buyer resistance created by higher financing costs. The promotional tactics that would have seemed generous during normal times felt desperate in the context of inventory that wouldn't move and floor plan interest charges mounting every month. Manufacturers found themselves in an impossible position, with production lines that couldn't be shut down without laying off skilled workers who'd be impossible to rehire when demand eventually returned. The boats rolling off assembly lines represented commitments made months earlier when order books were full and the future looked bright. But now those same boats faced a market that no longer wanted them at any reasonable price. Dealerships that had expanded during the boom, opening satellite locations or building new showrooms, now found themselves overextended with too much overhead chasing too few customers. The fixed costs of rent, utilities, insurance, and minimum staffing remained constant even as revenue collapsed, creating a financial squeeze that would bankrupt the weakest operations within months. By 2023, the industry was in trouble. Sales slowed, but didn't collapse. Dealers hoped the downturn was temporary, a correction after an unsustainable boom. Manufacturers cut production, but not drastically. They'd seen slowdowns before and believed demand would return once interest rates stabilized. But it didn't. Consumers who'd spent heavily during the pandemic were now dealing with inflation, that had driven up the cost of everything from groceries to gasoline. Discretionary spending tightened. Families that might have considered buying a boat postponed the decision. Used boat values, which had surged to absurd levels during the boom, began declining. Owners who'd paid top dollar for used boats during the frenzy discovered they were underwater on their loans, owing more than the boats were worth. The feedback loop was vicious. Falling used boat values made buyers cautious about new purchases. Why buy new when used boats were getting cheaper? But cheaper used boats meant trade-ins were worth less, making it harder for existing owners to upgrade. 2024 brought warning signs that should have alarmed everyone. Dealers reported slower traffic at boat shows. Fewer customers were browsing lots. Test ride requests declined. Cancellations increased as buyers who'd placed deposits months earlier backed out when their boats finally arrived. Financing rejections climbed as lenders tightened standards, recognizing that loan-to-value ratios were deteriorating. Repossessions began ticking upward as buyers who'd stretched to afford boats during the boom found themselves unable to make payments. Dealerships tried discounting, offering incentives, and extending financing terms. Some offered 0% interest for qualified buyers. Others threw in trailers, covers, or free winterization. But moving inventory became a struggle, and still, boats kept arriving from manufacturers who'd committed to production schedules months earlier. The annual boat shows that had once been packed with enthusiastic buyers now featured sparse crowds walking past displays with hands in pockets, looking but not buying, asking questions but not committing. Sales staff who'd grown accustomed to writing multiple deals per day during the boom now went entire weekends without closing a single transaction, despite aggressive pricing and generous concessions. The psychology had shifted fundamentally. Where buyers had once feared missing out on limited inventory, they now sensed desperation and waited for prices to fall further, knowing another discount was always just weeks away. Marine lenders began requiring larger down payments, often 20 to 25% instead of the 10% that had been standard during the boom, effectively pricing out the marginal buyers who'd fueled pandemic sales. Loan terms that had stretched to 15 or even 20 years for larger boats were pulled back to 10 or 12 years as lenders tried to reduce their exposure to depreciating assets. Credit score requirements crept upward, with lenders who'd accepted scores in the mid-600s during the boom now demanding 700 or higher for approval. Debt-to-income ratios were scrutinized more carefully, with lenders rejecting applications from buyers whose boat payments would push their total debt obligations beyond conservative thresholds. The repossession activity, while still modest compared to what was coming, signaled a disturbing trend. Buyers who'd been making payments faithfully were beginning to default as job losses, medical emergencies, or simply payment fatigue made the boat loan the easiest expense to abandon. Repossessed boats flooded wholesale auctions, where dealers bought inventory during normal times. But now even those auctions saw weak bidding as dealers recognized they already had too many boats they couldn't sell. The boats being repossessed were often nearly new, with low hours and full warranties, creating direct competition for new inventory at prices 40 or 50% below dealer cost for comparable new models. Manufacturers watched helplessly as their production planned 6 to 9 months in advance, based on dealer orders that had seemed solid when placed, continued churning out boats for a market that was actively contracting. Some manufacturers attempted to slow production by offering dealers incentives to delay deliveries or cancel orders, but contractual obligations and the mechanics of manufacturing made dramatic production cuts nearly impossible without shutting down entire facilities. Factory workers, many of whom had been hired during the boom to meet surging demand, began sensing the shift as overtime disappeared, shifts were reduced, and whispered conversations about potential layoffs spread through break rooms. The disconnect between what was happening on factory floors and what dealers were experiencing on their lots created a surreal situation where boats were being built with care and craftsmanship for customers who didn't exist. Dealer principals who'd been in the business for decades recognized the warning signs from previous downturns, but hoped this time would be different, that demand would stabilize, that the correction would be mild rather than severe, hopes that would prove tragically optimistic. Then came 2025. The collapse was swift and brutal. From January through April, only 64,883 new boats were sold, down from 71,321 during the same period in 2024. That 9% decline was bad enough, but April alone saw sales crash by 40% compared to the previous year. 40% in a single month. Dealers who'd been hoping for a spring selling season, the industry's traditional busy period when buyers emerge after winter, instead watched as customers stayed away. Lots that should have been emptying filled up. Boats that should have been on the water sat gathering dust and bird droppings. The inventory crisis reached critical levels. U.S. boat dealers were over-inventoried by 60% in April 2025. Think about what that means. For every 10 boats a dealer should have on their lot based on normal sales velocity, they had 16. Marinas rented out slips for storage. Dealers leased additional land just to park unsold inventory. Some boats sat shrink-wrapped, never having touched water, waiting for buyers who weren't coming. The financial pressure was immense. Every boat sitting unsold represented borrowed money, dealer floor plan financing that charged interest every month. Dealers were paying to store inventory that was depreciating in value while generating zero revenue. The decline hit different segments differently. Pontoon boats, which had been among the hottest sellers during the pandemic, saw sales drop 19.5%. These family-friendly boats, perfect for lake days and casual cruising, had been pandemic favorites. But now, families tightening budgets looked at $25,000 pontoons and decided they could live without them. Jet boats dropped 19.9%. Wake sport boats, the high-performance vessels that create massive wakes for wakeboarding and wake surfing, fell 14.3%. These were premium products, often costing $70,000 or more, appealing to buyers with disposable income. As economic uncertainty grew, that market evaporated. Even fishing boats, traditionally more resilient because serious anglers view them as tools rather than toys, declined 0.4%. Yachts dropped 0.7%. Nothing was immune. Wholesale shipments told an even darker story. Manufacturers cut production by 13% year over year, recognizing that dealers couldn't absorb more inventory. But even that dramatic reduction wasn't enough. The boats they'd already built and shipped were sitting unsold. New powerboat retail unit sales fell 7.4% in the 12 months ending February 2025. The trend was clear and accelerating. Dealers who'd expanded during the boom now faced impossible decisions. Do they keep paying floor plan interest on inventory that might not sell for months? Do they slash prices and take losses just to move units? Do they send salespeople home and cut overhead? Or do they hold on, hoping demand returns before their credit lines run dry? The macroeconomic context offered little comfort. Inflation had moderated to 2.3% by spring 2025, down from the peaks that had terrified consumers in 2022 and 2023. Fuel prices stabilized at $3.17 per gallon, high but not catastrophic. Interest rates, while elevated, had stopped climbing. On paper, conditions should have been improving, but consumer confidence remained weak. Americans were exhausted from years of economic uncertainty. They'd watched prices rise, rates climb, and their purchasing power erode. Even those who could afford boats were hesitant. Why commit to a major purchase when the future felt uncertain? Why take on debt for something discretionary when everyday expenses were still elevated? Regional differences emerged. U.S. dealerships were collapsing under the weight of unsold inventory and vanishing customers. But across the border, Canadian dealers reported cautious optimism as interest rates in Canada began easing. The contrast was stark. American dealers who'd ridden the pandemic boom higher than anyone were now falling harder. Canadian dealers, who'd been more conservative and less affected by the frenzy, were positioned better to weather the downturn. It was a reminder that markets are local, that timing matters, and that excesses always correct. Dealer sentiment hit historic lows. Confidence in the market fell to levels not seen since January 2014, when Baird Research began tracking the metric. 2014 was still the shadow of the 2008 financial crisis, a time when the industry was just beginning to believe recovery was possible. Now, more than a decade later, that same level of despair had returned. Dealers weren't just worried about this quarter or this year. They were questioning whether the market would ever return to anything resembling the pandemic boom. Many were concluding it wouldn't, that the boom had been an anomaly, a once-in-a-lifetime event driven by unique circumstances that would never repeat. The human cost was mounting. Salespeople who'd earned six-figure incomes during the boom now faced reduced hours or layoffs. Marine technicians who'd been swamped with rigging and service work watched as new boat deliveries dried up. Parts suppliers saw orders decline. Trailer manufacturers idled production lines. The ripple effects spread through communities where boating wasn't just an industry, it was the industry. Small coastal towns, where dealerships were major employers, faced potential devastation if businesses closed. Marinas that had expanded during the boom adding slips and amenities, now struggled to fill capacity. Boat lifts sat unused. Fuel docks pumped less gas. The entire ecosystem that supported recreational boating was contracting. Consumers who'd bought boats during the boom faced their own crisis. Buyers who'd financed boats at inflated pandemic prices were now underwater on their loans. A boat purchased for $60,000 in 2021 might be worth $45,000 in 2025, but the loan balance was still $55,000. Selling meant writing a check for $10,000 just to escape the debt. Many couldn't afford to do that, so they kept boats they no longer wanted, making payments on depreciating assets while struggling with maintenance costs, insurance premiums, and storage fees. Some simply stopped paying, letting lenders repossess boats that would be auctioned for pennies on the dollar. Those repossessions flooded the used market further, driving values down even more in a vicious cycle. The emotional toll was significant. Families who dreamed of creating memories on the water instead felt trapped by financial obligations that brought stress rather than joy, turning what should have been recreational escape into a source of constant anxiety. Insurance companies raised premiums as claims increased and boat values declined, adding hundreds of dollars annually to ownership costs that were already straining budgets. Marina operators reported increased numbers of abandoned boats, owners who simply stopped paying slip fees and walked away, leaving marinas to deal with the legal and financial burden of removing and disposing of vessels nobody wanted. The secondary effects rippled through households as boat payments competed with groceries, utilities, and other necessities, forcing families to make impossible choices between honoring debt obligations and meeting basic needs. The manufacturers faced existential questions. Do they continue cutting production, risking permanent loss of manufacturing capacity and skilled workers? Do they try to ride out the storm, hoping demand returns before their finances collapse? Do they consolidate, merging with competitors to reduce overhead and share the pain? Some brands that had thrived independently for decades began exploring partnerships. Others quietly laid off engineers, designers, and production workers. The calculus was brutal. Every boat they built added to inventory that might not sell for a year, but stopping production meant losing workers who'd need months to retrain if demand ever returned. It meant idle factories, wasted capacity, and fixed costs spreading over fewer units. Financing became a battlefield. Lenders who'd been aggressive during the boom tightened standards dramatically. Minimum credit scores rose. Down payment requirements increased. Loan-to-value ratios were capped at more conservative levels. Buyers who would have qualified easily in 2021 were now rejected. Those who did qualify faced higher interest rates and shorter terms. A 7-year loan became 5 years. A 5-year loan became 3. The monthly payments became prohibitive, even for buyers with good credit and stable incomes. And for the marginal buyers, the ones with average credit and modest down payments, financing simply disappeared. They were priced out of the market entirely. The regulatory environment added pressure. Environmental regulations affecting two-stroke engines had been tightening for years, pushing manufacturers toward cleaner 4-stroke designs. But those engines cost more to produce and purchase. Noise ordinances in some areas restricted engine types or operating hours. Wake restrictions on certain lakes limited where wake boats could be used, reducing their appeal. Safety regulations mandated additional equipment, adding cost to every boat. None of these regulations were new, but in a booming market, manufacturers absorbed the costs and passed them to eager buyers. In a collapsing market, every additional regulation was another burden manufacturers could barely afford to shoulder. The question haunting the industry was simple but terrifying. Is this a correction or a collapse? Corrections are healthy. Markets overheat, excess builds up, and a pullback restores balance. Prices adjust. Inventory clears. Weak players exit. Strong ones survive. Eventually, demand returns, and the cycle begins again. But collapses are different. Collapses destroy industries. They bankrupt companies, eliminate jobs permanently, and shatter consumer confidence so thoroughly that demand never fully recovers. The boat industry had survived collapses before. The Great Depression, the oil crises of the 1970s, the 2008 financial crisis. Each time, the industry emerged smaller, leaner, and more cautious. Each time, it took years to rebuild. Some analysts argued this was merely a correction from an unsustainable boom. Pandemic demand was never going to last. Manufacturers overproduced. Dealers overordered, consumers overpaid. Now the market was finding its natural level, lower than the boom, but sustainable. Dealerships that had gotten greedy would close. Manufacturers that had expanded recklessly would contract. But the core industry would survive, because Americans still loved boating, still valued time on the water, and would return when economic conditions improved. This perspective offered hope. It suggested patience would be rewarded. Others saw something darker, a fundamental shift in consumer behavior. They argued that pandemic buyers had tried boating and many didn't like it. The reality of ownership, the maintenance, the cost, the hassle of trailering or marina storage, the limited usable season in northern climates, had disillusioned them. Those buyers wouldn't return. Meanwhile, younger generations facing student debt, housing affordability crises, and uncertain economic futures weren't forming the boat-buying habits previous generations had. They preferred experiences they could rent or share, rather than assets they had to maintain and store. If this view was correct, the industry faced permanent demand destruction. The market would never return to 2020 levels because the buyers simply didn't exist. Environmental factors complicated the picture. Climate change was making weather more unpredictable, with severe storms, flooding, and droughts affecting when and where people could boat. Some traditional boating areas were experiencing water level changes that made launching difficult or impossible. Lakes that had been reliable destinations for decades were seeing declining water levels. Rivers faced new restrictions to protect endangered species. The traditional boating lifestyle was being challenged by environmental realities that no amount of marketing could overcome. The industry began exploring alternatives. Electric boats emerged as a potential future, offering quiet, emission-free operation that appealed to environmentally conscious buyers and satisfied regulators. But electric technology faced challenges in marine applications. Batteries were heavy, expensive, and had limited range. Charging infrastructure at marinas was minimal, and the boats cost significantly more than traditional gas-powered equivalents, pricing them beyond most buyers' reach. Some manufacturers invested anyway, betting that battery technology would improve and regulations would eventually mandate electric power. Others remained skeptical, questioning whether the market existed for premium-priced electric boats when buyers were already rejecting cheaper gas-powered models. The used boat market became a battleground. Prices that had soared during the pandemic plummeted. Boats that sold for $50,000 in 2021 struggled to fetch $35,000 in 2025. Sellers desperate to escape payments slashed prices. Some listed boats for whatever they could get, just to stop the financial bleeding. Buyers, sensing desperation, lowballed aggressively. The market became a buyer's paradise and a seller's nightmare. For the industry, collapsing used boat values created additional problems. Trade-in values dropped, making upgrades unaffordable. New boat buyers could find barely used boats at deep discounts, eliminating any incentive to pay full price for new inventory. Dealers found themselves competing not just with each other, but with private sellers dumping boats for any price. Regional markets fragmented. Florida, with its year-round boating season and massive coastline, remained more resilient than northern states where boats sat unused half the year. But even Florida dealers struggled. Texas, with its extensive lake systems and Gulf access, saw demand decline but not collapse. The Great Lakes region, Minnesota's Lake Country, and the Pacific Northwest all faced brutal conditions. In areas where boating was seasonal and weather-dependent, the value proposition became harder to justify. Why own a boat you can only use 4 or 5 months a year when it costs thousands to maintain and store? Smaller dealerships faced extinction. Family-owned operations that had served their communities for generations couldn't survive months of zero sales and mounting floor plan interest. Some closed quietly, selling inventory at auction and walking away. Others were absorbed by larger dealer groups that could weather losses longer. The consolidation accelerated. Fewer dealers controlling more locations, reducing competition but also reducing the personal service and local knowledge that had defined the industry. Corporate ownership brought efficiency but lost the character that made boating feel like a community rather than just commerce. The long-term outlook was bleak. Dealers expected weak demand for the next 3 to 5 years. That wasn't speculation. It was based on their order books, their customer conversations, and their understanding of economic cycles. Even if conditions improved, they believed buyers would remain cautious. The scars from the boom and bust cycle would linger. Consumers who'd been burned wouldn't rush back. Lenders who'd suffered losses would keep standards tight. Manufacturers who'd overproduced would stay conservative. The industry would survive, but it would be smaller, more cautious, and less optimistic than it had been in decades. Yet, within the crisis, Some saw opportunity. Buyers with cash could negotiate deals unimaginable during the boom. Boats that would have sold at full price in 2021 were available at 30% off. Motivated sellers would throw in trailers, electronics, and accessories just to close deals. For buyers with secure finances and genuine love for boating, it was the best buying opportunity in years. But those buyers were rare. Most Americans watching their budgets tighten weren't thinking about discretionary purchases, no matter how good the deal. The boat industry's collapse matters beyond marinas and dealerships. It's a measure of consumer confidence, discretionary spending, and the health of America's middle class. When boat sales boom, it signals economic security. People feel confident enough to take on debt for luxury purchases. When sales collapse, it reveals anxiety and constraint. The 40% decline in April 2025 wasn't just about boats. It was about Americans pulling back, tightening budgets, and preparing for uncertainty. It was about an industry that had soared to unsustainable heights, learning painfully that gravity always wins. This moment will be remembered as the end of the pandemic boom and the beginning of a long, difficult correction. The industry will survive, it always has, but it will look different. Fewer dealers, fewer models, more conservative lending, more cautious buyers. The excesses will be purged, the lessons will be learned. And somewhere in a few years, when conditions improve and memories fade, the cycle will begin again. Because Americans will always be drawn to water, will always want to explore, will always believe that owning a boat represents freedom and escape. The industry understands that. It's counting on it. The water is still there. The question is, who will be left to build the boats that sail it? Do you own a boat? Have you felt this market shift firsthand? Are you a dealer, a manufacturer, a marina operator, or someone whose livelihood depends on this industry? Share your experience in the comments. Let's talk honestly about what's happening and what comes next. And if you value deep, thorough stories about America's maritime world, stories that go beyond headlines to explore the economics, the people, and the consequences, subscribe for more boat industry documentaries and breaking marine news. This is a story that's far from over.